As long as it's off.
It's okay.
That's okay. People at the back.
A warm welcome to everybody to this Brown Bag Lunch on Political Risk Analysis, Public and Private Sector Perspectives. We are very pleased to welcome David Gordon, Head of Research and Global Macro Analysis at the Eurasia Group and formerly with the US National Security Council. He will speak about this topic, and I think it will be very interesting. We just concluded a Prem Learning Week course on political economy analysis, in which we discussed, a number of approaches of how do we do political economy analysis and governance analysis, and we also had some people here from other donor agencies, from the UNDP and from the EC, so we've looked a little bit what are other agencies doing, but of course there's also a wider world out there of political risk analysis. There's private sector companies that are looking at political risk analysis for a variety of reasons and for a variety of purposes and from a variety of perspectives. And I think it's very good for us to be a bit more aware of sort of what is out there and, are there things that we could use or that we should make more use of in a world that has become very complex, very interdependent, and where we do face reputational risk in a number of ways. I would also like to welcome Arshad Sayed, the country manager of the Mongolia country office. Mongolia is a little bit, in some sense, of a more out-of-the-way kind of country, but at the same time it is a country that is really affected by a number of global trends. It's a country that's very mineral dependent, so it's one of these sort of commodity exporting countries that's been very affected by the commodities boom and bust. And it's also a country that neighbors Russia and China. So the rise of China, when we speak about that, say with regard to Africa, for Mongolia, that's the next door neighbor. And so I think it's an excellent sort of, country perspective to think about how are we affected by global trends. I would like to give the word to David, and he will speak for about half an hour, then we'll have some comments from Arshad, and then we will open up for question and answers. Perhaps just to mention one more thing, there will be a recording, but the recording will be entirely of David's speech, so your comments will be under Chatham House rules.
Well, thank you very, very much. It's great to be here. I actually haven't given a talk at the World Bank in quite a while, but it's good to be back. I see at least one old friend, Jack Titsworth, in the back of the room. Perhaps there are others as well whom I don't recognize because my eyes aren't as good as they used to be. But let me spend a couple of minutes just introducing the Eurasia Group, the firm where I work, and then a couple more points about myself and that I think will be of interest to you. The Eurasia Group is a firm, a research and consulting firm working on political risk issues for financial firms in the private sector, for corporate entities, and for public agencies, government agencies, multinational agencies. It's about 10 years old. Its name derives from the fact that it originally focused on the states of the former Soviet Union, but we now actually have a global coverage. We are a firm of applied political scientists. So what we do is apply political science to issues that exist at the interface of politics and markets. And we do so in a way that tries to integrate country risk with broader macro risks. We also have a thriving analytic practice on energy and natural resource issues. So we have some sectoral issues that come into play as well. I'm brand new in the firm, having left government service, U.S. government service in January. For the last 2 years, I was the policy planning director for Secretary of State Rice. Before that, I was the vice chairman and acting chairman of the National Intelligence Council. The policy planning staff and the National Intelligence Council are the two institutions in the U.S. government that are frankly most similar to the Eurasia Group in looking at political risk in a structured and strategic way. Earlier in my career, I was the first democracy governance advisor in sub-Saharan Africa for the U.S. Foreign Aid Agency in the late 80s and early 90s, in which I basically began to do this kind of work at the country level and at the project level, including engaging with bank reps and bank staff all over Eastern and Southern Africa. So I do have some experience, albeit a little while ago, on applying political risk to the kinds of activities that the World Bank is involved in. Let me go through, I'm going to do 3 things in my talk today. One, I'm going to just have some basic introductory points about political risk. Second, I want to talk for a while about how we in the Eurasia Group look at the contemporary political risk environment. And then third, talk about some methodological issues, some tools that we use for assessing risk, and talk finally about the challenge of not only assessing risk, but making those assessments relevant for decision makers. And I think that's a huge issue, the interface between analysis and decision makers. It's one that I felt constantly when I was in government, and it's one that also exists in the private sector. So what is political risk? Quite simply, political risk is the probability that a political action or non-action alters the expected value of a given economic action or an expected outcome of a government policy. It's how does politics affect what otherwise would be market choices either being made by private entities or by national public entities. What does it take quickly to assess and manage political risks? 4 things. One, I think for businesses, but also for governments, it's understanding the potential consequences of political risk for the operations or for governments, for the policies, for the programs, for the projects that you are involved in and are managing. Second, it takes the employing of a structured way of thinking about political risk as a complement and supplement to economic risk and opportunity. Third, and this is very important, it involves embedding political risk considerations into the operating processes of businesses or public organizations. And finally, it involves having a portfolio view of risk to understand the implications and the interdependencies between and among political risks and other economic and business risks. So political risk is very often misunderstood and underappreciated by corporations. This is the reason why we're in business in the Eurasia Group and why we've grown very dramatically over the 10 years of our existence, from a firm of 3 or 4 people to a firm of nearly 100 people now undertaking this work. Political risks are the least likely of all risk categories to be managed well in the private sector. And geopolitical risks in particular are often perceived as least likely, falsely, to impact corporate outcomes. Yet there are many, many, many cases that we can point to. Let me just talk about 3 fairly recent ones. The first was the impact on Chiquita of the new EU banana import policy that imposed tariffs and quotas, led to a loss of some $400 million over 2 years and 1/3 of market share. A very direct outcome of a particular political risk. Secondly, the recent nationalization in Venezuela of Cargill Corporation assets as part of a broader pattern that we're seeing in Venezuela of the squeezing and taking of assets by the private sector, by the Chavez government in Venezuela. The third is the recent disappointment that Coca-Cola Corporation faced when its bid to acquire a local juice company in China was turned down. Coca-Cola had been the largest single sponsor of the Beijing Olympics. Coca-Cola had been engaged in close discussions with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and had been given assurances by the ministry that there was not going to be a problem with this investment. All of these are examples of the fact that considering economic events, considering investment decisions without reference to politics and to political forces gives less than a full picture of the potential for outcomes. As I look back over the last decade in Russia, I see at least 3 periods or 3 events and trends where underestimation of political risks led broadly to the wrong expectations both by private actors and by government actors. The first was the ruble devaluation back in 1998, which showed that sovereign credit default is not solely tied to a government's ability to pay, but also to its willingness to pay. And this was something that was largely missed by both the markets and by many, many governments, including my government. Second was the fall over a period of time in the past decade of the empire of Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Yukos. Today, particularly in the United States, we talk about financial institutions that are too big to fail. But the fall of Yukos was the result of an institution that was too big to succeed. When I was on the National Intelligence Council, one of my analysts did an assessment of Yukos and of Khodorkovsky that portrayed Khodorkovsky on a trajectory to become literally the richest man in the world. And I said to myself, he's going to be in big trouble. And of course, he was. But at every point in the Yukos episode, markets misinterpreted how far this could go because of a lack of understanding about the political environment surrounding Yukos. At every stage, the judgments both in markets and broadly by government analysts was, well, Russia may put a little bit more of a squeeze, but basically they aren't going to do much more. When Khodorkovsky was first put in prison, the notion was he'll be put in prison until after the elections, then he will be let out. When the firm was first being put under pressure, the notion was, yeah, there'll be some pressure to get additional taxation, but the Russian government will want Yukos as a firm, as a private entity, to continue to exist. That reflected a larger over-optimism, certainly by corporate actors and by government actors, particularly here in the United States, but really in the West more generally, about the potential for foreign investment in the Russian energy sector that lasted really until the middle part of this decade. So they're in a whole series of events in Russia where a misunderstanding of the nature of and the level of political risks led to important losses both by private entities, corporate and financial, and mistakes in government foreign policy. When we look at risks, at political risks, we talk about risks at 5 different levels, and let me build up from the bottom, because I think the first 2 or 3 levels will be quite relevant to the work done here at the bank. There's project level risk, when we're talking about firm-specific risk, regulatory compliance risk, self-generated risk, reputational risk, but risks that surround individual investment projects, be they in the private sector or in the public sector. There's firm-level risk at the country level, having to do with regulatory compliance, with regional politics, subnational politics more generally, and with the potential for rule of law not ruling on breach of contract experiences. There are industry-level risks having to do with discrimination, favoritism, corruption, again, regional and state-level politics. At the country level, we identify risks having to do with economic and policy elements that are heavily affected by politics. Capital controls, credit default, expropriation, but also issues in the political arena that are really beyond the control of any single or small group of political actors. Political instability, revolutions, coup d'etat, regime change more generally, civil war. Finally, at the global level, there are international wars, there is international migration, demographic changes more generally, there is the influence of global regulatory and norm regimes, OECD rules and norms, etc., WTO conventions, the role of different international organizations. Finally, there are questions of the evolution of geopolitics, the rise and fall of powers, the relations among powers and between powers that all shape the political risk environment at that top or global transnational level. So depending who you are in a firm, depending who you are in a public institution, you will be particularly concerned with a different set of risks. So when we go and advise a corporation about a particular investment in a particular country, we focus on a set of risks relevant to that investment. When we provide advice to the global strategy board of a major international corporation, we're providing assessment of really a quite different level of risk and range of risks that they have to be aware of and they have to be responding to as the main managers within the corporation, not of a country portfolio or a country set of projects or an individual project, but of a broader global portfolio and a global set of risks. So what is relevant in the political risk environment really depends on who the client is and what the level of engagement of that client is. Let me also distinguish between two kinds of risks that we focus on in the Eurasia Group. One is our mainline judgments about the political direction or the policy direction that will be influenced by the likely political play of factors and events. That is, will a certain tax regime be instituted? Will a set of regulations be applied? Is there a high probability, a likelihood of corruption coming into play for a particular investment decision or for a particular corporate decision? So there are sort of mainline risks and mainline judgments. But there are also risks associated with the ends of the probability curve, what we call the tails of the probability curves. Particularly important are times when those risks fatten. And so the president of the Eurasia Group and one of our research directors, Ian Bremmer and Preston Keat, have just published a book called The Fat Tail. And it's all about these occurrences that might appear highly unlikely, but in fact are of greater likelihood than would be expected in normal times. We're seeing that now. During the period of the global financial crisis and recession. I'll be talking about some of those later in my talk. But those are risks of a different order, what we call fat tail risks. These are lower probability events. These are not events that we're predicting as likely to happen, but they're events that firms, governments, decision makers need to be aware of because they have potentially very, 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 very high consequences. In our practice, many of the financial firms that we work with are mostly concerned with generalized risks. They're concerned with what's likely to happen in a regulatory environment or a political environment that could be traded on in the markets. So financial firms tend to be interested in risk, in marginal changes in risk that enable them to take a bet in the marketplace that would be different from other players in the markets because they're not factoring in political risk. Governments, corporations, when they make investment decisions, are often very interested in both knowing those risks, but are particularly interested in knowing what are the risks at the end of the probability scales. When I was in government, I was very interested in not only understanding who's likely to win an election in a country, but will an insurgent group succeed in making that election impossible to hold? Will there be a military coup that might take place following the intensification of ethnic conflict in a country? So the risks along the tails, the two tails of the probability distribution, are of particular importance at particular periods of time, and to government clients and to corporate clients often particularly in the circumstances where these risks fatten. So with these general comments in mind, let me talk a little bit about how we see the overall global risk environment. This is a very, very macro, just make a small number of macro points. Generally, political risks are increasing in 2009, macro-level political risks in much of the world, partially due to the financial crisis, the ensuing recession, but also due to a number of other factors, one very, very important one having to do with a particular form of political change here in the United States. So political risks are greater in most of the crisis countries that we're looking at, in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We can go into discussions of this later. We believe that the overall political risk environment in Iran with the nuclear program continues to increase. North Korea, we were at a moment over the last year when we thought that political risks in North Korea were decreasing. Now with the onset of a new American administration and a decision by the North Korean authorities to test the policies of that administration, political risks have been increasing. In our own hemisphere, political risks in Mexico as a result of the declaration of war by narco-traffickers against the Calderon administration have increased risks in that country. Certainly in Eastern Europe and parts of the former Soviet Union, the impact of the global financial crisis has substantially increased risk in those countries, including countries that we had thought were pretty stable, including Hungary and Poland. These are countries in which risky outcomes are still by no means the likely outcome, but risky outcomes for market players and for geopolitics are much higher than they were a year ago. So they're sort of fat-tail outcomes that we were talking about. The important political impact in the United States is the coincidence of the election of a new president, a Democratic Party president with the control, with very, very large majorities in the Congress. If you look at the economic and financial policy-making circles within the administration, compare those to the thinking that is going on in key congressional committees in the Congress, the Banking Committee, Senate Finance Committee, and elsewhere, there's actually a quite substantial disjuncture. We've highlighted potential conflicts between the executive branch and the legislative branch in the context of the need for a new regulatory regime, in the context of the potential need for recapitalization of the American financial sector as a major global risk, and one that people have to be looking at not only in the United States, but all around the world. More generally, coming out of the financial crisis, we've noticed important changes, in particular, a shift in the balance between political actors and market forces in shaping economic outcomes more generally and financial outcomes in particular. In a very, very real way, the financial capital of the United States has shifted from New York to Washington. Similarly, financial power in many other parts of the world have shifted from Dubai to Abu Dhabi, for instance, in the Gulf, from the city of London to the city of Westminster in the United Kingdom, from Shanghai, in some sense, to Beijing in China. At the same time, we're seeing the rise in a number of countries of populist pressures and pressures for punitive regulation. So we are also looking at a substantial change in the regulatory regime. Let me quickly shift to talk about some analytic methods before I turn the floor over for comments. We use in the Eurasia Group, we really use a balance of both qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis. Quantitative analysis by itself, we believe, ignores very, very important and very subtle political and qualitative issues that can't be captured in formula or models. While qualitative analysis gives too much of a bias to the specificity of country-level experiences and is biased against comparative and cross-temporal analysis that we believe can help give insight into political risk assessment. Qualitative analysis is most useful for providing in-depth understanding and detail to particular issues. It's important for issues in which other data is scarce, and it's useful to draw together different threads of quantitative analysis to create a comprehensive and comparative set of case examples. Quantification is useful for providing cross-national comparisons of particular risk indicators. Quantitative analysis is important in looking at correlating or failure to find correlations between economic outcomes and particular political processes and outcomes. And quantitative analysis is very important for being able to look at risks across a range of different national entities. So one of the important themes that we have is the balance of quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis. We also use scenario analysis, particularly to highlight the likelihood of fat-tail outcomes, of outcomes that don't look like they're the mainstream outcomes, but are outcomes whose possibility is still there. And again, in scenario analysis, the crucial thing is being open for key transition points where a political event or a political choice could take a decision process or a political process into a different direction or a different orientation. Finally, global trend forecasting, looking, for instance, at global trends in terms of role of government, global demographic trends, global trends in terms of political regime types, rule of law, etc., are important for helping focus assessment in individual country cases. So let me conclude by one last comment on making political risk viable for one's institutions. It seems to me that clear roles and responsibilities are needed for the reporting of risks throughout corporations and public agencies. That management, unless management regularly discusses political risks in ongoing fora, the chances increase that this kind of analysis doesn't get to the appropriate decision maker at the proper moment of time. But in order to do that, analysts have to be very, very aware of what kind of information and what kind of format risks need to be put into for the relevant decision makers. That if the analysts and the managers of the analysts don't understand how senior policymakers will be able to digest political risk assessment, that process of it's really a market failure, that the supply of risk and the demand for risk will not meet and make an effective market. So with those few points, let me open the floor up to questions or comments, and thank you again for inviting me over this afternoon.
David,